Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those who don't know me, I am Gregory Aresian, Professor of History and Archaeology here at the American University of Armenia, which I joined in the last 3 years after teaching at a number of top American US universities for 23 years. And today it gives me a distinct pleasure to introduce to you the most brilliant and the most serene person in the Armenian studies in the United States, in the history of Armenian studies in the United States, a great historian, the Dean of Armenian Studies in the United States, and my great friend, Professor Richard Hovhannisyan. When I'm thinking about Professor Hovhannisyan, what comes immediately to my mind, not only his deep not even the love that many students in many countries have for him and many colleagues. What I always think about, it's about his extreme commitment to what he has been doing for many years, for like 6 decades? Or 6 decades, yes, for 6 decades, even a little bit more. So this is a long journey of great insights, journey of great successes that resulted in great achievements. And here I want to say just 2 or 3 words. It's his extreme academic, scholarly, intellectual, and personal modesty. Because even here, today is the 3rd lecture. During his first lecture, when he was presenting his works very briefly, obviously he's the cornerstone of our study of the First Republic of Armenia, is 4 volumes of the history of the First Republic of Armenia, which will remain important and like its opus magna will remain for at least the next century, if not less. But also he mentioned a number of other things, including he showed this huge, enormous series published on the Armenian provinces and cities in Turkey, in Anatolia. And he said, oh, this is more or less for the general public, for the scholars. And this was one of his revelations of his modesty, because in those series there are at least 14 or 15 articles that I am using in my research and publications. So it certainly has a big scholarly value. And I want to mention one thing that is almost never mentioned about his achievements, that he started a totally new field in Armenian studies by publishing in 1983-84 the collection of papers on Armenians through foreign eyes, how the foreigners perceived Armenia. And it is only now that becomes very important, a new direction, essentially closely related to the issue of Armenian identity. It's very much, identity has 2 sides. It's how Armenians we perceive ourselves, and how the foreigners perceive us. And so he was absolutely also a pioneer in that area. And then I can tell you his absolutely heroic commitment working in archives, of which I was here a witness when he worked here in the National Archive of Armenia for his 3rd and 4th volumes. So I can speak probably for hours and hours about him. But right now I want to just briefly introduce his third lecture, which probably will be the crown lecture for this 3 lecture series, because it will talk about the foreign position of the First Republic of Armenia, foreign reaction, all those foreign entanglements, and he will elucidate for us the issues that became clear thanks to his research, and the questions that still could be brought up through further research. So let us welcome Professor Richard Hovhannisyan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Armenian. Generous introduction. Well, here we are, the third day in a tumultuous week here in Yerevan. I'm surprised that you braved whatever obstacles there are in here, and I'm thankful for that. Just to refresh, some of you have been here all 3 days, and others have been here 1 day or 2 days. So let me just remind you that what I tried to do the very first day was to look at the circumstances that brought about the independence of Armenia unexpectedly, and in some ways unwillingly, under the circumstances of a Russian civil war on the one hand, the abandonment of the Caucasus by Russia's war, separation of Russia from the Caucasus, and then the Caucasus itself, being unable to draw its constituent peoples together into a common front against the Turkish threat of invasion, which took place in 1918 and threatened the very existence of Eastern Armenia and the Eastern Armenians after the annihilation of the Western Armenians in the previous years. So it was not illogical that Armenian independence was declared under extreme pressure, and that there was no other option, and that the Armenians stood alone and had to make the best of the situation, which they did by accepting as a beginning a very small Armenian state here around this city of Yerevan, extending to Echmiadzin and Sardarabad in the west and to Lake Sevan in the north, a total of probably 8,000 or so square kilometers, and with total chaos, with no government tradition or real apparatus here, and with all of the Armenian center of intellectual, cultural, and political life having been 200 miles to the north in Tiflis, which was the Georgian capital, which became the Georgian capital, and the very painful transition of the Armenian leadership to move from the wonderful, splendorous banks of the Kur River to the little banks of the Harastan or Zangu River, as it was known at the time, and ended up optimistically with the end of World War I, which brought about the forced evacuation of the Turkish occupying armies from the plain of Ararat, from Alexandropol, now Gumri, and from the whole province of Kars. So within a few months within 6 months or so after its creation, the Armenian Republic was able to expand 4 times the size of its origins. And this was, of course, with the oversight and assistance of some British troops who had occupied the Baku to Batum railway and transportation. So it ended up on an optimistic light at the end of the first lecture. And last lecture on Wednesday, I tried to look at the infrastructure that was built gradually here in Yerevan with the creation first of an appointed legislature, the Horur, by tripling the number of members of the Armenian National Council that had been in Tiflis, and then the attempts to come out of what Hovhannisyan, the first prime minister, described as chaos without form, ansev chaos, the first steps that were taken, and the great difficulties, nonetheless, that Armenia faced that first winter, during which well over 100,000 more Armenians died because of Turkish atrocities, not by the Turkish sword, but by the creation of making them refugees, homeless refugees, without shelter, without food, and without medications, during which well over 100,000, mainly refugee, but not only refugees, also natives perished, along with the members of the Armenian government itself, no less a person than the original, many people regard, true founder of the Republic, Aram Manukyan, who had defended Yerevan and taken the initiative in holding back the Turks at the time when the Armenian leadership was still in Tiflis, and others as well. And finally, the experience of coalition government with the Armenian Liberal Party known as Jovurtagan, or the People's Party, which was an ideological brother of the Western Armenian Ramgavar Party, free enterprise, evolutionary, liberal, civil rights, supportive kind of organization. The experience of that 8 months of coalition, and ultimately, surprisingly, the sudden collapse of that coalition in June of 1918 because of something that was unexpected that it should collapse, and that was a declaration by the Armenian government that was proclaimed by Alexander Hovhannisyan, the then prime minister, after Kardashian had left for America to secure funds for Armenia. Then Alexander Hovhannisyan, the former mayor of Tiflis, became the prime minister here, and he declared on the first anniversary of the Armenian Republic on May 28, 1919, a declaration in which he said that the government henceforth would represent all the Armenian people of both Eastern and Western Armenia in an act of united Armenia. And that was justified on the fact that the Armenian representatives in Paris were calling for Western recognition of a united Armenian state, and were pushing for means for the Armenian refugees from Western Armenia to be able to return to their homes. And it was important for the Armenian government in Yerevan to say that it spoke for all Armenians and not just for one segment of the Armenians. But that was, and that was approved by members of the Armenian People's Party, the Jovurtagan Party, at the time. But within a week there was a reversal, maybe because of news they had received from Paris, or maybe because the Tiflis center of the party felt that this was untimely to declare a united Armenia based on the existing government in Yerevan. They were concerned that the interests of the Western Armenian segment of the Armenian people, who were in 1919 mainly in refugee status in the Middle East or in colonies in Europe and America, that their interests had not been properly taken into consideration, and that their leadership had not been previously consulted. And they had reference particularly to Boaz Nubar, who was the head of the representative spokesperson for the Western Armenians, for the Turkish Armenian, as they were known at the time, for the Turkish Armenians, the spokesperson for them before the Western powers. It was he that they often turned to when they wanted to consult on Armenian issues. It was he who was a main figure in the organization of Armenian volunteer detachments in the French army known as the Légion d'Orient, which later became the Légion d'Armenian, in which Armenian volunteers from America, from Musadak, from Kesab, from Europe, joined together in Cyprus to train to form an auxiliary unit to the French army, and that played a very important role, that legion, in the General Allenby's conquest of Palestine in 1918, and moved further on into Cilicia at the end of 1918, thinking that the French would honor their pledge to emancipate Cilicia and make an Armenian home there. They were mistaken. He was mistaken. It didn't happen, but that's the kind of person that Boaz Nubar was. Politically, let me just show him. Where's this thing? I have a thing here. Voila. No. Here's Boaz Nubar. Politically, he was a conservative, son of a AGBU, and so you can see a very distinguished looking gentleman, conservative, and he had around him a lot of Western Armenian intellectuals, well-known poets and writers, Vahan Tekeyan, Arshak Chobanyan, and a number of other established figures there. They tended to be very skeptical of socialism and the parties that embraced socialism, such as the Hanchagyan Party and the Dashnakh-Tuchun, both of which were revolutionary socialists and were therefore not looked upon very favorably by this circle of people. They eventually formed what was known as the Armenian National Delegation, which was a number of individuals that did include two members of the party Dashnakh-Tuchun as representatives of the Turkish Armenians, the most important of whom was Garikin Pasturmadjan. His nom de guerre was Armengaro, was a member of the Armenian delegation, at least for a while as well. Well, when the populists withdrew from the Armenian coalition government, they felt that this man, Boaz Nubar, had been slighted, that he hadn't been a part of the decision-making to declare a united Armenian republic, but they had even a greater fear. Western Armenians had this very deep suspicion of anything Russian, and anything that smacked of Russianism. And for them, Yerevan was in the Russian Empire, and the people around Yerevan were known as Russian Armenians. They were different, but most important, what they feared was that if this became the center of a future Armenian state here in Yerevan, it might mean that what the Armenians deserved in Western Armenia, their provinces in the West, might be jeopardized because the Allied powers are very clever. And they might just say, okay, we recognize you, Yerevan, and now we've fulfilled our promises to the Armenians that they should have a secure national future. You can have it there, and maybe we'll give you a little more land in the province of Van. and Alashkert and Bayazid and maybe the eastern Erzurum region. And so they were very, very concerned that the Arabian Republic here might be used as a ruse, as an excuse not to give the Armenians what they fully deserved, and their focus was very centrally on the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire and extending beyond that to Cilicia, where there had been the last Armenian kingdom that had fallen in the 14th century, and a very large Armenian minority population had continued to live in that region on the Mediterranean Sea down through the centuries, and how important it was to have a Mediterranean outlet for the future Armenian state, for it to have free access to the European world. At the end of 1918, the Armenian Khorut, the Armenian legislature, had several sessions trying to decide what it is that the Armenians wanted, that is, to define. I think we still have this problem. If you ask 10 Armenians, what is it that you really want? What is it for the genocide? What kind of solution, or what kind of solution do you seek? You'll find a very large range of responses, from simply, accept the truth, I'm satisfied, don't lie anymore, give honor to the victims, that's all I want. And that's many American Armenians feel that way, because they don't want to ever go back to those lands where their grandparents and great-grandparents came to. And that there are others who say, no, we want our lands. So you have a lot of different responses to that question. The same thing was true at the end of World War I. What is it that the Armenians really should want and ask for, logically? The extremists, and particularly Western Armenians, because 12 Western Armenians were seated in the Act of United Armenia. One of the symbolic gestures was that 12 Western Armenian deputies were seated into the Armenian legislature as a symbol of this kind of unification that took place. Western Armenians, again, whether they were ARF or not ARF, Tashak Sagan or not Tashak Sagan, they were more maximalist. They wanted to have as much land and territory as was possible, particularly from the Ottoman Empire. The Eastern Armenians, and particularly the more socialist-oriented leaders of the ARF, were a bit more cautious. And after a lot of debates, they came down to the instruction that they were going to give to their delegate that was going to leave for Paris. His name is Hovhannisyan, well-known, romantic, melancholic Armenian writer, to tell him that we will ask for the unification of Eastern Armenia, province of Yerevan and province of Kars, and some parts of Tiflis and Elizabethpol, gubernias or provinces, uniting these with the 6 traditional Armenian provinces of the Ottoman Empire. That is, you know them by now, but Van, Bitlis Mush, Harper, Erzurum or Garin, Sepasya, Lesser Armenia, and Dikranagierd or Diyarbakir, minus the fringe areas beyond the mountains and beyond the rivers that were primarily Kurdish populated. So, and with an outlet on the Black Sea. An outlet on the Black Sea, the Pontus, which was also, by the way, claimed by the Greeks at the very same time, but Premier Venizelos, the very sympathetic Greek prime minister to the Armenians, had made it clear that he would not push for the incorporation of Pontus into a Greek state because of the economic necessity of this region on the Black Sea for a viable Armenian state. And so Hovhannisyan set out to Europe with that caveat, or those claims, at the beginning of 1919. And when he arrived in Paris, when he arrived in Paris, of course, he found the Armenian National Delegation was very active at work, and they had an entirely different idea. And that is that Armenia should include also Cilicia. Now that's a big extension. For those of you who have a sort of a map of Turkey in your mind, it's going from the Euphrates River all the way over Caesarea, Cappadocia, Gessaria, down to Marash and Adana and Aintab, and then the Gulf of Alexandretta, or Iskenderun, and the port of Mersin, or Mersina. That was an enormous area, and that's why they call it Armenia Zovezov Hayastan, Armenia from sea to sea. That is what the Armenian National Delegation foresaw. So there was a lot of horse trading that took place. It would be very bad if the Armenians presented two different desiderata or desires, claims to the Paris Peace Conference. So ultimately, Hovhannisyan's ARF colleagues, Western Armenian comrades, persuaded him to go along with Nubar Pasha and the Armenian National Delegation, so that in February 1919, when they presented their Armenian case before the Paris Peace Conference, they showed this was the Armenia that they desired. I mean, you might call it a pipe dream now, totally unrealistic, but look where it would be from all the highlands of Karabakh and the Akhokalak and Akhoskha, including parts of the Black Sea, and coming all the way down to the region of Cilicia. But here's the story. That sounds ridiculous now, and it seems totally out of touch with reality. And you can't see it very closely, but what I want to tell you is this was exactly in keeping with both the American and the British foreign ministries had foreseen as a future Armenian state. And you don't see it closely because there are the Armenian proposed boundaries, the British proposed boundaries, and the American proposed boundary just before the end of World War I or just after the end of World War I. In other words, at the time when Turkey was defeated, these powers seemed to be favorable to the exclusion of Turkey from all of these eastern provinces. I just want to read a couple of things that they had said in the year leading up to the end of World War I. David Lloyd George promised Armenia would never be restored to what he called the blasting tyranny of the Turk. And he continued, Arabia, Armenia, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine, in our judgment, entitled to a recognition of their separate national condition. And then he said, in a famous speech he made in late 1918, from the moment war was declared, there was not a British statesman of any party who did not have it in mind that if we succeeded in defeating this inhuman empire, one essential condition of the peace we should impose was the redemption of the Armenian valleys forever from the bloody misrule with which they have been stained by the infamies of the Turk. In February of 1919, the Foreign Ministry of Great Britain, the Foreign Office, led by Lord Curzon, made a sketch of what the future empire should look like, the Turkish Empire should look like, and it defined here the creation of an Armenian state from the Gulf of Alexandretta to Diyarbakir, to the Persian frontier, to to a point near Trebizond on the Black Sea, and then the Russian Armenian districts of Olti, Kars, Alexandropol, Yerevan, Nakhchivan, and Julfa. So here it was, at the time that Aharonyan arrived in Paris, the claims of the Armenian National Delegation, however outrageous they might seem today, were in keeping with the plans of the British, and the Americans were no different. In the outline in September 1918 for a future peace, it says the Ottoman Empire is to be reduced to Anatolia. Armenia and Syria are to be erected into protectorates of such governments as seem expedient from domestic and international points of view, and the guarantee is that both countries be given self-government as soon as possible. So you have a big brother to help these countries, Syria and Armenia, through a protectorate, through a mandate system, until as soon as possible they could become fully independent. And again, for the Transcaucasus, it says the Armenians of Transcaucasia should be given permanent independence as a part of the new Armenian state. No local differences set them apart from their kinsmen in Turkey, and they should be reunited with the rest of the Armenian population in the region to give the new state every reasonable element of strength and grouping in a common domain, people of the like religion, political sympathies, and speech. And I have other declarations, and again, the map that the it was known as the Inquiry, which was to inquire about what should the peace settlement be, drew boundaries, but very little difference from the other two. France had reservations because France wanted ultimately to annex Cilicia or else to take control over the region of Cilicia. I'm sorry, here again. When Aharonyan arrived in Paris, therefore, he should have had and would have had a sympathetic hearing, and as a matter of fact, only the Armenians were allowed to appear before the peace conference. Neither the Georgian delegation that was sent was received or listened to, nor was the Azerbaijani delegation that came to Paris received. The Armenians were put in a special category. There was enormous sympathy for them from the very outset, from World War I onward. And Armenia, they believed it was justified to separate Armenia from Russia, whereas the other countries were questionable, because the Allied powers felt that they should not try to prejudice the future of Russia by recognizing former regions of the Russian Empire, because that might weaken the White Armies and the attempt of the anti-Bolshevik Russian forces to destroy the Soviets, and they didn't want to do that. But they felt that Armenia was an exception, because first of all, it was a peripheral province. It had nothing economically or otherwise major in the integration of the Russian economy, and for all other reasons, it should be treated separately. Aharonyan soon found, however, that he was going to be disappointed. He believed that Armenia had earned a place at the peace conference because of all of his suffering, because the Armenians had been dubbed the Little Ally and had given so much, but technicalities prevented the seating of the Armenian delegation because it had been agreed that only belligerent powers, those at war with Turkey and Germany, or those powers that had severed diplomatic relations with Germany, would be eligible to become members. And in telling Aharonyan and Nubar about this, they lavished their love upon the Armenian people and said, be sure that your views and your cause will be defended by us. We will, we're committed to do this. And the other things that were primary for the Armenians was repatriation. This, as long as you had 500,000 Armenian refugees in the Caucasus, there could be no normalcy of any kind. No economic normalcy, no political normalcy. It could be chaos. And the food crisis would continue. And so it was urgent that the Allies open the doors to Western Armenia by removing the Turkish armies that had been allowed to stay there by the armistice in 1918. In the draft treaty of the armistice of Mudros, the Turkish armies were required to withdraw from the eastern provinces. But in the negotiations, the Turkish negotiators were able to get that changed and argued that if the Turkish armies withdrew, there would be anarchy there, people would be killing and looting and so forth. There had to be some degree of security. And so the Turkish armies were allowed to stay there when they should have been withdrawn. And the only thing in the Mudros armistice said, in case of disorder, the Allies reserve the right to occupy any part of or all of these regions. Well, a lot of disorders did take place, but by that time they were not willing to commit troops to occupy the area. So that was a problem, to have Turkish armies still in Erzurum and still in Van, Mush, and so forth. And the Armenian refugees here in Yerevan, all over the place, impatient, angry with the government, clamoring for the right to return. I don't know if you ever had to live a refugee existence and how terrible that is. I remember in 1988 and 90, when I was at the Armenian embassy now in Moscow, the poor refugees from Baku, miserable people, 20 families in one big room. It's not a happy existence, and you want to get home. You want to go home as quickly as you can. And so that was the second major thing. Recognition. They asked for recognition of the Armenian Republic, because without recognition, it really couldn't even seek foreign aid or foreign loans, because it had no international standing. And all of these, great deal of sympathy was expressed by the Allied powers, but on all issues, there were technical issues that made them stand back. And it became very, very frustrating for them, for the Armenian leaders. And petition after petition after petition, and when I use the British archives, it becomes repetitive and monotonous, with Aronian and Nubar Pasha writing appeals day after day after day. 3 months had passed since the end of the war. 4 months had passed from the end of the war. 5 months had passed. 6 months had passed. 8 months had passed. And yet nothing is done. When are you going to do something? When are you going to do something? These were the Allied leaders, Orlando and Lloyd George, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, and Orlando, the French, British, and Italian prime ministers, all of whom had made such beautiful declarations about the future safety of the Armenian people. And down below, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, who tried all he could to assist Armenia to get the Turkish armies out of the place, and particularly to hasten the treaty with Turkey, to hasten it. It was delayed month after month after month, because ultimately the Allied powers decide first things first. And the first thing they wanted to do was to impose a crushing treaty peace treaty on Germany. That was their primary objective, the destruction of the Reich and its power, and everything else had to take a second fiddle, a back burner, a back seat, and unfortunately the Turkish treaty was treated in that way. The United States president was Woodrow Wilson. No one can doubt that he was an Armenophile. He encouraged donations for the starving Armenians. He encouraged all kinds of benevolent activity. He allowed for the American grain administration to send Armenia surplus grain. And as I said, although it was only 2% of the world grain that was given by the United States around the world, nonetheless that 2% was to keep many of the Armenian people alive for the next year. He was a Democrat. And next to him was Henry Cabot Lodge, senator from Massachusetts, and the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate. The Foreign Relations Committee. The Senate, in any American treaty, must ratify, must confirm a treaty, and not just by a simple majority, but by 2/3 of the vote. 2/3. These two men, formerly both professors, hated each other. They were both members of the American Committee, at least Lodge was, American Committee for the Independence of Armenia. So they were sympathetic to Armenia. Yet Wilson gave the Armenian cause a terrible blow by being enormously stubborn and enormously undiplomatic. For when he came to Europe as, the man on the white horse, the hero of Europe, because the American soldiers had fought in France and helped to defeat Germany, and he was the world's most popular figure probably in 1919. But when he came to Europe with a delegation to attend the Paris Peace Conference, he excluded Lodge and he excluded all influential Republicans and came with a very partisan delegation to Paris, which was suicidal even for his own wish to have a League of Nations and his own wish to have a German treaty signed. In the end, he was going to be scuttled by his own stubbornness and by not bringing and including the Republican Party. And he came to the decision himself that as much as he loves the Armenians, and as much as he wants to take a protectorate for Armenia, and he made these wonderful, wonderful, moving declarations and speeches, that he had to wait to put that proposal before the American legislature until after the German treaty had been concluded. In other words, the Turkish treaty has to wait until we have finished the German treaty. And that German treaty took several months. It was concluded in June of 1919. And then that crushing treaty that in some ways also brought us to World War II, that crushing treaty was then taken to the Senate. That treaty also included the formation of Wilson's baby, the League of Nations, the Covenant of the League of Nations. He desired so much to create a world league that would struggle to end all wars, and that he wanted to see the United States as a leader. But because of this issue, and not only his own stubbornness, but what happens after wars, a sense of recoiling, we want to bring all our boys home, as quickly as possible. Foreign entanglements, why did we get involved in this foreign European continent? That's not our continent. All of these reasons, recoiling into isolationism, which wouldn't have been the case if he had struck right at the beginning, after the war, and he asked for a mandate, because he would have gotten it then. There was so much bilateral and bipartisan sympathy for Armenia, but he put it off and giving time for reaction. And in this case, you probably know, if you know U.S. history, that the Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, the German peace treaty. And twice it was put before the Senate, and twice the Senate rejected it, even though they had a majority in favor, but you had to have 2/3 to ratify a treaty. And when you didn't have the cooperation of the Republican leadership, there was no way that you were going to get 2/3, and that was the case. When, in November of 1919, the Senate rejected the German treaty for the second time, a great blow to Woodrow Wilson, who soon after suffered a stroke, became incapacitated, was unable to become a strong advocate for the Armenians any longer. Then the Americans sent the message to the other Allied powers stating that the United States is withdrawing from the peace conferences, and we will not participate in the drafting of the Bulgarian and the Turkish peace treaties. That was a major undermining of Armenian aspirations, because without American support and American participation and our American signature to any peace treaty with Turkey, it would be lame. And it didn't take the Allies very long. Already at the end of 1919 and the beginning of 1920, consultations between Lloyd George of Great Britain and Clemenceau of France already sounded the signal of retreat. In their conferences, they now came to the decision that these Armenians are really gone too far, they're asking too much, they're making too much noise, we're getting tired of them. We're still committed to a creation of an autonomous, self-governing Armenian state, but these Armenians want much too much. They're totally out of touch with reality, even though they themselves, less than a year before, had made that same declaration or drawn the same boundaries. Now it was a question of whether we should have a larger small Armenia, or a smaller Armenia, which meant, should we have Armenia with Yerevan Republic and add to it the eastern part of Erzurum province and Van? Or shall we have a larger small Armenia, which would incorporate the great fortress city of Erzurum? The British War Office, the military, were all opposed to any sizable Armenian state. They believed it was totally out of the question, totally impractical, totally indefensible. They didn't want Erzurum to go to Armenia. The Foreign Office, on the other hand, under Curzon, insisted that Erzurum had to be a part of the new, even if it's a smaller Armenia, even though we're forgetting all about Sebastia, we're forgetting all about Dikranagerd, we're forgetting all about Kharpert. But even that smaller Armenia, it's important that the Armenians have a defensible boundary. And if Erzurum remained in Turkish hands, says Curzon, Armenia will always be under the threat of invasion. And that it has to be within the Armenian boundary. Now this I'm making a very long story short. This bounced around a long time, and very bitter internal struggle between the Foreign Office and the War Office of Great Britain and the other states. All of the victors of war, that's another thing when you delay treaties. People who are allies in a war, if you allow it to go on afterwards, they're going to turn against each other, and they're going to be scrambling for the spoils, who's going to get what. And that occurred here after World War I as well. In a very clever move, in April of 1920, when still there was not a Turkish peace treaty at hand, they thought it would be finished at least by the spring of 1920, but here we are in April, and they still don't have a final treaty. Yeah, they have a drafting committee. They're making a very long document. It copies some things from the German treaty, and they're adding some new things themselves. And important things they're adding themselves, but there's no treaty. In order to get over this conflict between whether we should have a small Armenia or a small, larger Armenia, and in order to get out of any blame, Lloyd George, this very wily Welshman, came up with a brilliant plan. He said, look, the Americans said they don't want to be a part of the treaty anymore. We have this real big problem, and we don't want to be responsible either for giving Erzurum to the Armenians or not giving it to the Armenians. So why don't we do the following? Let's call on President Wilson, who loves the Armenians so much. Let's tell him, look, Mr. President, we have decided that we are going to create a moderately sized Armenian state, and we're going to ask you, as the President of the United States, whether or not you take the mandate. We'd be very happy if you take the protectorate for Armenia. But if you don't, if the United States doesn't take that protectorate or mandate, you as the President, as an individual, we're asking you to arbitrate the boundary within given limits. And the given limits we're giving you to decide where to put the Armenian boundary. Starting on the Black Sea is Trabzon, and then coming down is Erzurum, and coming down is Van, Muş and Bitlis, and then Van, 4 provinces. In these 4 provinces, you are allowed to draw the border where you think is best. And we will accept this, and we're going to draft a treaty that will become known as the Treaty of Sèvres, August 10th, 1920. We're going to draft a treaty, and we're going to compel the Turkish delegates to sign off and say, we will accept whatever boundaries the President of the United States decides within these 4 provinces. They can't, in other words, Wilson, by this, even if he wanted to give part of Karpert, and there were reasons why he should give a part of Karpert, he couldn't do that. It was the 4 provinces. In this way, this Lloyd George brilliantly took the onus of making decisions, very critical decisions, about the future of Armenia, took it away from themselves, the responsibility, and threw it onto the President of the United States of America. And what is surprising, he took the bait. He took the bait and agreed to draw the boundary. And that took for a very, very long time. It took several months. And it was not until December of 1920 when finally President Wilson sent the borders as he or his commission had decided they should be. And that is what we today refer to as Wilsonian Armenia. Many people think the United States signed the Treaty of Sèvres. They did not. The United States was not a part of the Turkish treaty. And that's another reason why the United States continuously could beg off and saying, hey, we weren't at war with Turkey, we didn't sign the peace treaty with Turkey, so let the European powers do what they're asking us to do. Vahan Kardashian was the moving force behind the American Committee for the Independence of Armenia. He, I mean, imagine you could get 30 state governors and numerous hundreds of college presidents and cardinals and priests and ministers, all begging for the independence of Armenia, even though it didn't happen, but he was the force beyond that. And his antithesis was the American High Commissioner in Constantinople, Admiral Bristol, who was a real imperialist, who opposed any partition of the Ottoman Empire, who called the Armenians and Greeks and Jews the worst of all names, and said if you're going to create an independent Armenia, then you should create an independent Italy in the Italian town of New York, and an independent China in Chinatown was his, and his stressed the open door, free economic policy, and for that he wanted to see the largest possible Turkish empire remaining in place. This was, I'm going to skip over these. During all this time, Armenian diplomats, both official and unofficial, were hard at work all over the world. Here was, at the top, a representative in Iran, in Rome, in Germany, Diana Apkar in Yokohama, Etienne, Brazil, in South America, Armin Garo, I'm sorry, in the United States, the Tiflis Embassy of the Republic of Armenia, Harutyunyan in Baku, Sagatelian in South Russia. So you have, and there were representatives in Africa, in Djibouti, in Addis Ababa, in Cairo, in Izmir. All over, these people are running around trying to do something in support of Armenia and bringing support to Armenia. I think I don't have time, but if I did, I could really go into some of the very moving statements that were made in all of this. The currency, Armenia finally was able to print its own currency by a British firm. Unfortunately, the Republic did not last long enough for it to be put in circulation, but it was used as souvenir money in all the fundraising things. Well, I'm going to go on and skip over this. Let me just, the second anniversary of the Republic of Armenia on May 28, 1920, was very different from the first anniversary, where there was still a lot of reticence among the Western Armenians, among the Turkish Armenians, toward the independence of the Armenian Republic because of this fear that Turkish Armenia would pay the price for focusing just on Yerevan. But by the second anniversary, all the Armenian political parties, both here in Yerevan, except for the Communist Party, and around the world, united in commemorating the independence of the Republic of Armenia. And they had joint military missions, Armenian military mission and civil missions, that went from community to community, gathering gold and jewels for the Armenian army. I have not spoken at all about really the struggle for Karabakh and all the fighting that took place along the borders from Nakhchivan to Karabakh. But let me just read the mission that going to New York. Imagine yourself in diaspora. Imagine yourself having gone through 4 or 5 years of war, not knowing what's happened to your families back home in the Turkish Empire, if they're living, if they're dead. If any of us survived, and here we have the Prime Minister of an independent republic coming to the Hippodrome in New York City. and arousing 5,000 people in the Hippodrome with declarations extending greetings from the hallowed peaks of ancient Masis, the blossoming slopes of Arakats, the towering mountains and deep valleys of Artsakh and Sunik, the verdant shores of Mother Aurochs, the pristine waters of Sevan, the awe-inspiring ruins of Ani and Dvin, the mother cathedral of Echmiadzin, the magnificent monasteries of Hagbat, Datev, Ganzasar. There was no longer a czar, a shah, or a sultan. That hallowed land today is ours, compatriots, yours and mine. Over the territory of Armenia, there already flies an Armenian flag. Do you hear? An Armenian flag. Despite their suffering, the Armenians did not want pity. They sought only temporary assistance to defend the infant state and expand into Van, Mush, Garin, and other historical national homelands. We ask this, he says, without shame, because our role in the World War gives us the right to place this question before the great powers, before the civilized, progressive peoples, without being afraid, confident in our resources and in our capabilities. So, you can ignore the reaction, the hysterical hyperbole and hysterical excitement of a desperately starving Armenian population or people for this kind of upliftingness. In the end, this was what President Wilson decided through a lot of very fine specialists in drawing the boundary that would include the Pontic seacoast, again with the approval of Prime Minister Venizelos of Greece, even though many of the Greeks here were not happy with that. And going down over the Pontus Mountains, going down through Erzurum province, and including the city and fortress of Erzurum in the Republic, including Bitlis, including Mush, including Sasum, including Van, into what would become the United Armenian Republic, and if united, of course, would have all this rich land, very unlike the rocks of around Yerevan, the very rich farmlands of Western Armenia. That was not to be. That was not to be, because the Allied powers refused to give the military forces necessary to expel the Turkish armies from this expanse, and it remained to the very end under Turkish occupation, and this became the dream to this day of Armenian nationalists of a future Armenian state. Meanwhile, by the time the Treaty of Sevres had been signed, Azerbaijan had been Sovietized. The Red Army was pushing on the borders of Armenia. The Armenians sent a delegation finally to Moscow, headed by this intellectual Levon Shant. I don't know why they chose him. He was a Western Armenian. He didn't know Russian well. And again, I don't know why the government would have sent him there. Maybe because he was strong anti-communist, maybe because they didn't want him to make a deal. I don't know. Something that we have to examine. In any case, very quickly things developed in this area. Once Mustafa Kemal, the heroic leader of the Turkish nationalist movement, who rejected the Treaty of Sèvres, who wanted to destroy the Treaty of Sèvres, decided that the best way to destroy that treaty was at its weakest point. And its weakest point was in the east, here in Armenia. That was the weakest point of the Treaty of Sèvres, which, if I should put in parentheses, did not only include those boundaries that I showed you, but also provisions. Oh, sorry. Well, I lost it. Provisions for the trial and trial of the perpetrators of the Armenian massacres, for committing the Turkish government to release Armenian women and children held in captivity. There are many phrases or clauses relating to auxiliary and ancillary points on punishment of Turkey for its inhumane and barbaric treatment of its minority populations. The Turkish government took it upon itself in the treaty to assist in the gathering of evidence from the interior provinces. All of these were in the Treaty of Sèvres, and Mustafa Kemal set out with his general Karabekir to destroy. And so, after he had gotten from Moscow assurances of monetary and military support, shipments of arms and gold, and assurances, at least from the emissaries that went to Moscow and assured Mustafa Kemal that Russia would not intervene, Soviet Russia would not intervene if he took military action against the Armenians. It was then, in September of 1920, very soon after the Sèvres Treaty, that the Turkish armies invaded deep into the province of Kars. And then followed one of the most humiliating military defeats probably in Armenian history, led by terrible generals, Russian-trained generals, unaccustomed to Armenia and its environs. The Armenian forces collapsed in front of the great fortress of Kars in October 1920 and fled. And that great fortress fled, and the country was in total demoralization. And it was at that point, that the Soviets sent down their envoys to negotiate with the last prime minister of the independent republic, Simon Varatsian. The Armenians had no choice. They were demoralized and had lost half their land of the republic, and more than half the land of the republic was again occupied by the Turkish armies. And once again, Yerevan seemed to be a potential victim of Turkish aggression. So in his negotiations, or his representatives' negotiations, with the Soviet envoy, Legrand, Boris Legrand, they reached an agreement whereby the Armenian government would relinquish power to the Soviet system in return for a pledge from Soviet Russia that it would compel its Turkish allies to withdraw back to the border where the fighting had begun. What does that mean? It means the restoration of Surmalu and Ararat, the Mount Ararat, and the restoration of the fortress of Kars and the region of Kars to Soviet Armenia. But it also meant giving up and relinquishing the dream of having a united Armenian state with Van and Mush and Erzurum. Other points were made that they were not persecute any of the former leaders of the independent republic, the military, or political leaders who had taken action against the communists when they had tried to rebel against the Armenia government in May of 1920. That agreement was signed on December 2nd, 1920. And 3 days later, Soviet Red Army, or 2 days later, marched into Yerevan, coming from the north, from Delegation, and Soviet rule was established, in name at least, in Armenia. The sad aftermath of that is that the treaty that had been signed on December 2nd was quickly repudiated by the new Soviet government. None of the provisions that had been promised and pledged were actually enacted, and that eventually would bring about another upheaval and more bloodshed in Armenia as the Armenians rose up against Soviet rule in February of 1921. Some people think for the better and some would think for worse, and that brought to an end the experiment in Armenian independence after the Red Army had Sovietized Georgia, then turned back all its force onto Yerevan, and in April of 1921 drove the Armenian Salvation Committee, as it was known, to the mountains of Zangezur, where, under the leadership of Karikin Najde, they continued to struggle and resist for another 3 months until July, by which time Lenin had sent down another communist cadre and leadership under a much more veteran Bolshevik leader, Alexander Myasnikov, or Myasnikyan, who began a new era in Soviet rule by chastising the old first Bolsheviks who came in and destroyed the country and the faith in Russia and in communism, and started a new era of gradual rebirth of the Republic of Armenia, now as the Soviet Armenian SSR from 1920-21 until 1991, during which time, as you know, an entire infrastructure was built up, economic, political, cultural, in this country, despite the single-party rule and the repressive measures taken in the Stalin era. And finally, here we are with the Republic of Armenia in 1991 and the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh since the 1990s, whose future now is in everyone's hands and your hands. So how do I end? Republic of Armenia was not and is not what is most highly desired. Was not and is not the ideal of what we thought it should be and it would be. But it is a reality. And the question is, what do you do with that reality? There are many questions about the First Republic that I still have unanswered, and I need to have my Soviet or my Armenian colleagues answer it. How does it happen that at the same time Legrand, who is in Yerevan, is pledging Soviet support for Soviet Armenia, Soviet Red Army to expel the Turks and so forth, and before that is promising that Soviet Russia wishes to recognize the independence of the Republic of Armenia. And on the other hand, the Soviet Red Army is taking aggressive measures at the very same time. We need to get into the military archives, to the political archives, to know how do these jive? How can you be assuring people that you are wishing them the right to self-determination, to determine their own future, at the same time are amassing armed forces in Karabakh and near Yerevan on the other side there? How do you do that? What were the agreements that were signed or not signed, maybe unsigned, even verbal, between Mustafa Kemal's representatives in Moscow. When they come back and they assure Mustafa Kemal that Russia will not intervene and Russia is sending arms and gold. But I do not have any minutes of those negotiations. I have no records of what was said on a day-to-day basis. And again, I look to my Armenian colleagues who might have access to the military archives and the political archives and the secret minutes of the Soviet leadership as to what occurred. We do know this, and I think we all appreciate it, that the rebirth of Armenian statehood was truly a blessing in disguise. I call it also the Republic, my terminology, an unfinished symphony. It started, a movement was there, it grew into a first movement, but it was stopped, interrupted from continuing to its natural conclusion. And so it's you in this auditorium, it's youth in the street today who hold in their hands the possibility of continuing the symphony. Thank you.
Maybe Professor Hovhannisyan would take a few questions. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor. Probably one of my two questions is a part of those 3/4. I wonder if you could also give a small account of the uprising in March, May 1921, and how that might have affected the Armenian Soviet Republic in its formation. And my second question, sir, a little bit more vague. I know you have personally interacted with some of these leaders of whom you spoke later on in their lives, and I'm just curious how they accounted for the Republic themselves and what kind of personal responsibility, and did they justify things later on in their life, or did they have very objective, cold-hearted views, or I'm just curious how they felt.
Well,
thank you, sir.
That's another lecture, but February uprising, again, in my youth was idealized in anti-Soviet circles. They looked upon it as being a continuing struggle of the Armenian people for freedom, for independence. And that had an element of truth. It was very poor. Initial Soviet rule, vindictive Soviet rule, looking, if you have a real revolution, you have to have blood. And the young communists sought blood by imprisonments and exile. They weren't supposed to harm the army, and yet they exiled the entire Army officer corps to Samara. They arrested former political leaders and imprisoned them when they were promised they were not going to be doing that. But most of all, they took it out on the poor peasants in the name of war communism. War communism was that period in which everything for the cause, for the war effort. And so you could take the poor peasant's last horse or last cow or last sack of wheat in the name of war communism. And you had these commissars, they called them commissars, running around impoverishing the already impoverished villagers. And so the Armenian villagers probably looked with relief on the return of Russia. They were used to Russian rule. They may not have liked everything under Russia, imperial rule, but they understood it. They could work with it. Even today, there's a nostalgia for Soviet rule here in this country, because you tend to forget what was bad about it, and you remember the better things that we had, full employment and 2 weeks in Sochi or Sukhumi or somewhere, the good things of life that were there. And so the Armenian peasant probably initially didn't mind at all that the Red Army had returned, but when they came to your village and took everything away. So again, probably the dissatisfaction was sparked probably most of all by Western Armenian groups and khampabeds, led by these Eastern Armenian intellectuals like Hovhannisyan, who headed the Armenian Salvation Committee. Was it good or bad? In a way it was good, because when they went to Zangezur, and again, I know if I hadn't done so many other things and got waylaid by genocide and other things, I really needed to write this 5th volume, which I didn't write, about this very period. So there is the view that if the February uprising had not taken place, if the Armenians had not gone into Zangezur, where they made their last government of Sinik, and if Myasnikian had not come and assured in negotiations with these people and trying to get a bloodless compromise and peace, that Zangezur might have gone to Azerbaijan. And that by that uprising, the Soviets had to promise that Zangezur would remain a part of Soviet Armenia and not be given to Azerbaijan. Now that's one interpretation. I don't have enough information to really say that that was absolutely true, but you know, if I were to do a study, I would find the answer to that probably. The downside of the February uprising probably is it is that very same moment that in Moscow, Turkey and Soviet Russia were making a peace treaty together, a treaty of friendship, which would draw the final boundaries here. The fact that Armenia was in rebellion might, I can't say for sure, the fact that there was an anti-Soviet uprising here at the time might have made it easier for the Soviets to cede to Turkey everything that Mustafa Kemal wanted here, including Mount Ararat, which had never been a part of Turkey in modern times. It had been a part of the Yerevan province, and Kars and Ardahan. The only thing that Turkey didn't get that it wanted was the port of Batum, which was preserved not for Armenia, of course, but for Georgia, in the Treaty of Moscow. So in many ways, you know, again, I can't say that, because even if that hadn't happened, Turkey could very easily have been as adamant as they were, because you well know, probably if you've studied this, that even the Soviet Armenian representative and foreign commissar who went to Moscow was excluded from the negotiations that were going to determine the fate of Soviet Armenia. The Soviet Russia agreed with Turkey to keep the Armenian foreign minister out of the negotiations. So, you know, and that was then reconfirmed in the Treaty of Kars in October, when Soviet Armenia, Soviet Azerbaijan, and Soviet Georgia went to Kars and signed the very same treaty that Soviet Russia had signed with them. So it's a question I fully cannot answer, but one can speculate on this. As for the leaders, they probably try to put memoirs, try to put the best light on things. I found Hovhannisyan to be quite, considering the fact that he was within the government all the time and a member of the Bureau of the Tashnak. I found his Hayastani Hanrabitun to be quite enlightening. I wouldn't agree with everything that he has to say, but I thought that was, of all the memoir writings, including those of Hovhannisyan and others, probably the best. I think their feeling is that they did the best they could for their generation, and that what occurred beyond that were because of circumstances beyond their control, which I agree with. The failure of the great powers to lift their finger to help sustain an independent Armenian state was fatal. They had, I mean, if we compare, I read some pledges. Just look at those pledges at the very beginning. And their actions at the very end when they simply, said, too bad, we're very sorry, very sorry. And also, fatalistically, that the Caucasus belongs to Russia, so there's nothing we can do about it.
Okay, let's take 2 more questions, please.
We have some questions from our online viewers because, as you know, the Armenian Virtual College is live streaming this lecture. So the first question is, were there ever plans for a population exchange with the Kurds and Turks living in the proposed Soviets of High Armenia? Something similar to the Greek-Turkish exchange in 1923.
No, there was not, but it was clear that if that had become Armenian territory, a very large segment of the semi-nomadic Kurdish population would have left the area, and it would have been filled by Armenians from around the world who were repatriating. On the other hand, there was a proposal by Americans that the Armenian population of Karabakh be exchanged for the Muslim population of Yerevan province and Nakhchivan. There was that proposal that was made, never realized, but there was such a proposal.
Okay, and the second question is, did Kazim Karabekir massacre civilians during the Armenian-Turkish war? If so, could this be considered as a continuation of the Armenian genocide?
I cannot say that he massacred Armenians. There were probably certainly the Turkish forces did massacre Armenians, particularly in 2 villages in the area of Spidag and Jajur, near Jajur station. 2 Armenian villages were massacred, and some of them were quite naive because their leaders had put on red lapels as that they're Soviet now and were brothers Arkadash and so forth. So there were massacres, but not extensive. Certainly there was a lot of death caused by dislocation, and again, it's happening in bad times. But I would not call it an organized massacre in a general sense. I would call it more like the massacres that are taking place under the Kemalist era in Giligya, where in Hajin, in Marash, and other areas they besieged the Armenians and ultimately killed thousands of Armenians in order to get rid of them, and more so with ethnic cleansing, to force the Armenians to leave the area of Adana, Aintab, Marash, Hajin, Zeytun, and other areas, so that this could become a monolithic Turkish state.
Thank you.
I have another question, and you talked about the isolationism of the United States.
Yeah.
But as we know that in 1917, as you said, U.S. sent his troops to Europe.
Yes.
And this wasn't isolationism anymore. They were in big game.
Yeah.
So, and we have another evidence. It's very connected with our question, our Armenian question, that Armenians in 1920, before signing the treaty with Moscow in Alexandropol, before that they signed another treaty by refusing to recognize the Treaty of Sèvres anymore.
Yeah.
So what do you think? The isolation is the main obstacle for taking mandate of Armenia from United States. So thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. You're right, they broke their isolationism to enter the war, but they recoiled immediately after the war and went into double isolation. They were appalled that they had lost so many young American men in Europe, in the European War, and the isolationism. Let's go back to the Monroe Doctrine, which is to, we deal with the Western Hemisphere, let the Easterners deal with their hemisphere. So strong isolationism, which was manifested in the administrations after Wilson with Harding and Coolidge, they reached. What they didn't get isolated in, though, was their desire for open door and economic equality and exploitation. So the Americans kept that, but they didn't want to get involved politically in any way. As for renunciation of Sevres, of course, when they were defeated, they were forced against their will to renounce the Treaty of Sevres. But again, Alexandropol Treaty was never ratified either by Turkey or by Armenia, but nonetheless it became de facto in many ways because of the Kars and Moscow treaties became the de facto.
Yes, but before we, in the same day, August 10th, we signed a treaty with Russia and refused to recognize the Sevres Treaty.
No, not on August 10th. No. What they did on August 10th was to allow Red Army temporary occupation of Karabakh-Zangezur, temporary, but not renunciation Treaty of Sevres. The treaty, they didn't even know about the Treaty of Sevres on August 10th. That was the same day, so they wouldn't have known about it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's thank very much Professor Hovhannisyan. And I also need to mention, and we need to give a last round of applause to AGBU, the Armenian General Benevolent Union, because for the sponsorship of this lecture. And I also would like to thank all of you for your participation, for your interest, and wish you all the best.